Hi everyone! Today I'm going to be talking about the differences between ISTJ and ISFJ. So basically I'm going to be continuing the series that I started a while ago with respect to comparing different MBTI types. So far I've talked a lot about these kinds of comparisons, so some of the videos that I've created follow topics such as INTP versus INTJ, ENTP versus INTP, INFP versus INFJ, ISFP versus ISTP, ENTJ versus ESTJ, and many more. So feel free to check out the playlist. And other than that, today we will be continuing this series and focusing on the differences between two other types that can sometimes look similar to each other, namely ISTJ and ISFJ. We will cover some main differences in terms of thinking and feeling, in terms of cognitive functions, so extroverted thinking versus extroverted feeling, introverted feeling versus introverted thinking, and we will also be looking at interaction styles and communication styles. So all about that in the next few minutes. If you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and let's dive in. So, I mentioned that originally we will be looking at the main difference between thinking and feeling. Again, this is a more surface level distinction, but it's important to understand it before we dig deeper into the functions and the other aspects. So, ISTJ is a type that has a preference for thinking in their decision-making process, whereas ISFJ is a type that has a preference for feeling in the decision-making process. If we go back to Carl Jung, in his book Psychological Types and other resources that he created, he talks a lot about the distinction between thinking and feeling, and he calls both of these judging processes. This is not to be confused with the letter J that resides at the end of half of the types. However, in Jung's original definition or description, judging means making a decision. So in a way, using these functions in an active way in order to decide something. Intuition and sensing are perception functions, so functions that enable us to perceive the world around us, to gather information, whereas thinking and feeling are functions that make use of that information in order to make a decision and to help us act. So, if we think about ISTJ and ISFJ, for the ISTJ, because they have a preference for thinking in their decision-making process, they are more likely, at a very simple, basic level, to prioritize facts, logical information, let's say a slightly more objective approach to things, whereas the ISFJ with a preference for feeling is more likely to prioritize making decisions based on values, especially social values or the values of the group, feelings, especially feelings of others, and a slightly more subjective approach to things. I'm saying slightly more subjective because Jung thought that extroverted processes, like the extroverted feeling in the ISFJ, are more objective functions because they deal with the external, whereas introverted functions are more subjective because they deal with our own perception of things. But anyway, in our current language, we can also, refer to thinking parts as more based on objective facts, and we can refer to feeling parts as being more related to more subjective components of our experience, internal experience, I mean. So how can we cascade this into functions? Well, first of all, it's important to understand that just because someone has a preference for thinking or feeling, this doesn't mean that that's the only way in which they can make decisions. I know this can sound trivial, but I'm seeing this as a pattern, as a misconception, as a way to create stereotypes, which isn't really ethical and isn't really, a way to encourage people to develop. It's important to remember that typology is not here to make us laugh at each other or be mean to each other, but rather is a way to create more understanding and more tolerance. So if it supports us in that endeavor, we can, proceed and use it. But if we notice that we're becoming rigid in the way that we think, perhaps that's a sign we might need to open our perception a little bit. So, if the ISTJ has a preference for thinking, what kind of thinking is that? Well, in this case, we're speaking about extroverted thinking, also known as TE. So this means that specifically for the decision-making process, ISTJs tend to be quite good at looking at external facts and integrating that kind of information when it comes to making decisions. So a lot of people who have a strong TE are quite good at absorbing like facts from the external world or getting information from experts and incorporating that information in the way that they make decisions. Which is why you will see that a lot of ISTJs, more so than the ISFJs, are likely to go and seek expert advice or expert input, especially when they're trying to make an important decision, and they're more likely to trust that kind of information when they make decisions. I've mentioned this in some of my older videos on, exploring differences between TE and TI specifically, and I've noticed that TE prefers having a more efficient approach to decision making. And this sometimes means that TJ types specifically, like the ISTJ, will be more likely to say, okay, I need to get information from external sources because I don't feel like, spending all this time thinking about all of these myself. I also want to apply them. I also want to move forward with a certain process. So the advantage of this type of thinking is that it enables these individuals to sometimes move faster and not overanalyze things as much or be stuck in a lot of internal loops. However, sometimes it can also be a disadvantage when they fail to recognize some certain nuances in the way that things look like, or certain differences in perception. I'm going to slightly link this to the TI, or the introverted thinking that ISFJs have, not as a dominant decision-making function, but as a tertiary function in their stack, or as a child function. Because this is where the two types have a pretty notable difference, in my opinion. ISTJs will function in the way that I've just described, whereas ISFJs are more likely to give input to their own understanding of how something works, which means they will be more likely to say things like, it depends, or we need to look at this from different perspectives, or we need to think about it a little bit more, and they're less likely to look for expert advice from a very concrete or factual point of view. They might look for expert advice, but more so from the feeling spectrum, and I'm going to cover that in a moment. Okay, so we talked about TE, and we also talked a little bit about TI, which is specific to the ISFJ rather than the ISTJ. Now let's look at the feeling functions. The ISFJ dominates, let's say, their decision-making process with extroverted feeling, or FE. This is their secondary function, also known as the parent function. And this is the function that the ISFJ uses in order to understand the values or the social input that comes from an external source. So the values of other people, the feelings of other people, things that are related to creating emotional harmony or social harmony, things that are related to what brings the group together, what makes people come together. So they are more likely to value these kinds of things when they make decisions more than perhaps they value other things. At the same time, when it comes to their own thinking, this tends to be an introverted process, like I mentioned earlier. On the other hand, ISTJs have introverted feeling. This is their child function or their tertiary function. So this means that when they make decisions, they are more likely to be aligned with their own values. First, they rely on extroverted thinking, but if the decision involves this idea of values, feelings, etc., they are more in tune with how they feel about something. They are more in tune with what they value personally. And sometimes they might struggle to explain this to other people, or they might not like it. I've noticed quite a lot of ISTJs and INTJs get annoyed when people ask them how they feel. And they tend to be a bit more closed off in that sense. It might take a little bit longer for them to trust you and share their feelings. Whereas the ISFJ, having extroverted feeling, has a bit more of a tendency to be open and emotionally expressive. And something that I noticed with a lot of FE types, especially, you know, in their like natural environments, they might struggle even to like keep a straight face when they feel something strong. And other people might recognize feelings in these people more so that they recognize feelings on TJ types, who more stereotypically tend to have a more obvious poker face. Not always. I'm not saying this applies in 100% of cases, but this is a pattern that I've sometimes noticed. Anyway, so thinking, feeling, we've covered this distinction. Now I also want to talk a little bit about interaction styles and communication styles, according to Linda Burns's model. So first, if we look at ISTJs, they are part of the chart the course group or finisher group, whereas ISFJs are part of the behind the scenes group. And here there's a pretty big difference. ISTJs are more likely to communicate in a direct or directive manner, which means that if you ask them questions, they are more likely to be concise, more likely to answer in a way that is kind of to the point, and is more likely to try to direct the energy of the conversation in a certain way and to direct other people with the wording that they use. On the other hand, ISFJs, being informative communicators, they are more likely to give you like a larger context, even though maybe you didn't ask for that information, because they want to make sure that you understand what they're trying to explain to you. They are more likely to cover more ground or to give more detail, and sometimes they can be less concise. Also, something typical here to the energy of informative communicators is that they tend to be quite I feel like saying softer in the way they express themselves. So they don't have this like directive energy. They have a more like all-encompassing energy without trying to push the conversation or other people in a certain direction. And other people in this group are INFPs, ISFPs, and INTPs. Also, when it comes to the way that they work on things, ISTJs, being chart the course types like INTJs, INFJs, and ISTPs, they are more likely to set a goal, an ideal thing that they want to achieve, and then to make sure that they keep themselves on track while they work towards that goal. Similarly, they are also more likely to try to keep other people on track while they're working towards that goal. On the other hand, ISFJs, it's not that they're bad at this, because I would say that, you know, with their introverted sensing, they can also be quite structured in that sense. However, their preferred approach is rather a behind-the-scenes approach, which means that they tend to invest more energy in creating a perfect outcome for something. And they also tend to be a little bit slower at the beginning of a certain process, which means that they might take a little bit longer to learn something or to do something, because they want to invest a lot of energy and time into doing that thing well, into doing that thing in a way that is actually like meaningful to them, or in a way that satisfies their standards. And then once they master the thing, they can be exceptionally good at it. They might just take a little bit longer to take action sometimes, especially compared to ISTJs. Okay, so these are my thoughts on the main and most notable differences between ISTJ and ISFJ. We covered thinking and feeling, and then more specifically TE, FE, TI, FI. And we also looked at interaction styles and communication styles and the differences that these two types show. Thank you very much for watching this video. Thank you very much for being with me once again. And as always, see you next time with another video on typology.